Welcome to this session called Polycrisis versus Europe, the role of young leaders. My name is Marie Ringler. I'm the Vice President of the European Forum Alpbach. I'm also a member of the Global Leadership Group of an organization called Ashoka. I'm here with three amazing young leaders, and we have a fourth chair. And that fourth chair is for you. And we'll start with introductions and some first words and inputs and thoughts from our esteemed panelists. But then I'm going to invite you to join this conversation. So while we're getting started, you can already think about your contribution. So I'm here with Sophie Pornschlegel next to me. She's Director of Studies and Development at Europe Jacques Delors, and she previously worked as Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. She's written a book that's called At the End of the Established Order, Rethinking Political Power, and has a number of other pretty, impressive things in her CV. Next to her is Kanishka Narayan, who's a Labour MP for the Vale of Glamorgan from Wales. This is his week 7 as an MP, and we're very happy that he's making time for us here. He's advised ministers on domestic public policy. He's been a senior advisor at the Cabinet Office, and he's also advised the Labour Party front bench as head of tech policy. He's also somewhat of a community organizer. We just talked before this. He organized shops on high streets in his area during COVID-19 lockdown and made sure that senior citizens had access to essential goods. And then next to Kanishka is Stephanie Cox. She was born in Sydney, Australia, but has lived in Austria for most of her life. I know she's somewhat of a rebel because I also work with her. She began her career as an independent consultant and coach for startups, and then went on to found one of Europe's biggest job fairs for refugees, called Chancenreich. Full of opportunity would be the translation to English. And at the age of 28, she became a member of parliament in Austria in the role of spokesperson for digitalization, education, and equality. And since September 22, she's working at Ashoka as the lead for the work that Ashoka does with children and youth and empowering them to self-identify as change makers. Now, my first question to the three of you is really, what is the number one challenge that you worry about, but also moves your heart? What keeps you awake these days? And all of you are also powerful people. How do you address this particular challenge within your particular sphere of influence? Do you want to kick us off, Stephanie?
I love that you added the heart part to it, because if you like adding that onto it, I would actually, the first thing that comes to me is, and it's kind of the hat as a former member of parliament, the lack of inner work a lot of global leaders are doing. And
what do you mean?
What do I mean with that? I wanted to elaborate. We talk a lot about the climate crisis, and that's also what keeps me awake. But I would say there is the inner climate we need to take care of, and that means empathy. That means if you don't love yourself, how should you love others? It means how you treat others. And what I've seen in Parliament, there are a lot of broken people and humans. And I think that's where I believe if we do the inner work, because there's a lot of outer crisis, but if we don't take care of our inner crisis, and there's a lot of things, it's not only meditation and all of the things we know, but it's also really the self-love we have. And I think it really starts with things like that. And you said, like, what am I doing? Right now, I guess you all experience it. Like sometimes in life you're a leader, and sometimes you're a ladder, kind of, and hopefully both. Like a ladder, I mean you encourage others, you empower others to become their best self. And what the privilege I have right now at Ashoka is to empower young change makers on their inner journey, also to strengthen their ethical fiber, their empathy skills, their turning their ideas into reality, because if you do that in a young age, I believe you're going to be someone who's going to shape democracy in a really important way. So we really need to start young. And one more thing to add to it, what I love doing right now, as an answer to what I said, we need to do the inner work, is confronting young change makers with people in power. Because what I see is that on both sides there are a lot of learnings, and if there's an eye-to-eye level, there's this reverse mentoring happening, which is, I think, really important and which we need on a high level right now.
Sophie, you were going like that, but do you really agree?
Yes, no, so basically, just so you understand where I'm coming from, I just did the peace session in the loggia upstairs, so I'm quite in a meditative state right now, not fully ready for a panel. And the term inner work really resounded with me, because I was going to say that the biggest challenge we face is the climate crisis. At Europe Jeunes de l'Or, we do work on sustainability issues. I kind of switched fields a little bit, working on democracy and rule of law, to going to the climate, because you can re-democratize a country, you cannot change climate change. Once it's there, it's gone. So we don't have that much of a choice, and there's a speed issue in terms of timing, how much time we have. And there's a lot of things, but I think if you look at the climate crisis, one of the big issues we have is the issue of decision-making not delivering what we need, which has to do with power, which has to do with people that are in power, with vested interests, with people that do not see maybe the bigger picture, that do not do the sacrifices that we need to do. And so it's very much linked. And it's also linked to another point, because I'm coming from that wonderful session before to peace in a way, because if you look at what the climate crisis is, it's mostly against us. It's not, I don't like when people say we're going to save the planet. No, the planet is going to be fine. We're not going to be fine on this planet. So it's very much about preserving humanity in a way, which sounds pretty big, but in the end, that's what it's about. And that really has to do with being more constructive and a bit less destructive, and actually making peace within ourselves, with the rest of humanity, but also with the planet. And that sounds quite big, so I'm going to leave it there.
What are you doing about that?
And what I'm doing about it is that it's funny, because I'm sitting next to two people who are very much in politics, and I think that's really the biggest vehicle you can get. And I never really wanted to get into politics, because maybe I'm not done for it.
Same here.
So I ended up in think tanking, which, because I am quite political, I believe in politics as a vehicle of change. But I think I was better at explaining and researching and trying to give us the best recommendation I can give. And that's
so what
I'm
is your
trying to
best
do.
recommendation?
Well, I'm trying to advise decision makers on how to do policies, which can be quite technical, in making sure that there's also a translating function from very technical stuff into policy making, because you do have MEPs that do not necessarily have the expertise, because it's normal, you've just been elected, so you kind of need to also get the advice, and I think that's really important, because it creates better policy making. And one last point I'm doing is also explaining a lot. And we had the European elections, and we had then the French legislative elections, which were a bit of a curveball. But I did a lot of explaining in media, hoping to inform. And I mean, it is a bit of journalistic work, but it's also expert work of trying to explain, also the constraints of politics, to explain why it doesn't move forward as quickly as we wish. also holding some politicians accountable for what they haven't done. Yeah, then I'll stop here.
Kanishka, what keeps you awake at night, and how are you addressing that now that you are an MP?
Yeah. Well, can I just start by saying a big thank you, Marie, to all of you and to EFA for having me here. I read in your pamphlet that you were trying to expand the possibilities of imagination, and standing this morning having spoken about immigration policy, followed by quantum mechanics, followed by Welsh youth policy, whilst overlooking the mountains, I thought you are curating the possibilities for imagination in a very deep way. So thank you for doing that. The central challenge that keeps me up at night is, in some ways, the challenge of the distance between conversations in rooms like this and rooms in the Vale of Glamorgan, which is the constituency I serve. And in particular, this experience that whilst our public sphere has exploded and expanded offline and online, it is also very deeply fragmented. And so one of the symptoms of that, I spent the last 18 months every single week knocking about 500 doors, speaking to 200 people. So we knocked 50,000 doors, spoke to 22,000 people over the last 18 months in the Vale of Glamorgan. And the primary observation I had was that all the metrics and segments of political science of voter types were very imperfect now, because the pace with which people are moving tribes and forming sub-tribes of sub-tribes is very high. What that means is a very, very high level of uncertainty and volatility in our politics. So 50 years ago, in British constituencies and British general elections, only about 8% of seats moved more than 5%. Most people knew where their identity, their tribe was. In this election, that went from 8% to 72%. None of us are safe. I think we all feel this in political terms. But the thing I feel more deeply is the sense of fragmentation of who we think we are politically and what we're talking about politically. And you asked what I'm trying to do about it and why it moves my heart. Well, it moves my heart because it's very personal to me. If I think about the single most salient issue that came up on the doorsteps of the last 18 months in the Vale of Glamorgan, and it's expressed in polling of swing voters and voters who are not traditionally Labour, my party, immigration was a central issue. Now, I'm not just a child of migrants, I'm a migrant in the United Kingdom. And so the reason it's important to me is because there is an easy path to that question which dismisses people who have concerns about immigration, who think that somehow the story of my experience in Britain is not a story they want for the future of Britain. That's obviously a personal and pertinent question. But I remember very specifically a conversation I had with a lady who is, I think, in her 70s in the Vale of Glamorgan. The Vale of Glamorgan has very low levels of immigration. There's barely an immigrant in sight in most places. But to her, immigration was the central challenge in politics. And after about 30 minutes of literally expressing why she felt uncomfortable about me, and I felt more comfortable about her experience and her talking about it openly, I felt we reached somewhere that had a seed of persuasion, if not the outcome of it. And so it's personal to me as an issue. It's personal to me because, in some ways, the story of my life is the story that's at stake for the future of kids growing up in the United Kingdom and prospectively moving to the United Kingdom. And so it moves my heart for that reason. What I'm trying to do about it is to bridge the gap between conversations in places like up back here, the possibilities of imagining what the world could look like here, with the possibilities and realities of daily life. So every single week, we are still, when I get back home from Westminster, we're out knocking doors, trying to speak to people one-to-one, regardless of which sub-tribe they're in, to try and build a coalition, a tribe of people independent of where they've come from, but instead driven by where they want to go.
Thank you. Now is your moment. Maybe someone's heart is racing. That's a very good indication that you have something important to say. Preferably if you're young.
Actually, if the heart is racing, it's applauding the courageous act you're going to do.
Yes.
Your heart is applauding you joining us here.
So I'm looking for, yes, please, come up on stage. Yay! And please tell us who you are, and please share your perspective.
Hey. Hello, my name is Misha. I come from the Czech Republic and live quite internationally around Europe in the past 5 years. And my heart beats for change in education system. It's very dear to me, and I think I was educated through quite a broken education system in the Czech Republic, which forced me and many other, basically all the people in my country to memorize facts, not to use our brains to think, not to critically argument when we are in places like that. And what I'm doing about it is that 9 years ago, I joined an NGO as a mentor to help high school students to find their path forward and be socially engaged in their communities. After 9 years, I co-lead this organization. We have 100 plus of mentors in our community and 450 plus mentees who successfully ended our program. And I hope that in the future, I will spark some very important discussion with political leaders about our education system, which really needs to change.
Thank you. Stephanie, I saw you smile. No, please stay.
Stay. This is
Conversation.
your seat. This is the thing what sometimes happens. We like, it's important that you're here. So you need to stay and not run. So you want me to respond, or did you want to add another question?
No, I mean, do you have a reaction?
I just saw myself sitting in the education committee some years ago, and
In the parliament.
in Parliament, and being so frustrated. Like, I really feel your frustration, because if you're in a position where you can add to changing the law, but then you understand that on the back of the education system, it's an emotional discussion of black and white, of left and right, and not about the future. And that's why I think initiatives like yours are so important, because they bring the important fresh wind me as former politician, you as a politician, I think often don't have. I think it's really important. I see them sometimes like a renewable energy windmill blowing the energy, and it's really, and it's sad that it has to have something like that, but it, yeah. Thanks for your work.
Sophie, from a policy advisory perspective, what do you tell people? What should be the role of young people in power?
So in general, I think it's mostly, and that's important to me to have like more of a holistic view. It's mostly about having a diverse, representative policy sphere, which, I mean, age is one part of it, but it also is about, background. It's about people with disabilities or not. And I think in general, we do have obviously a lack of diversity in politics, which is bad from a representativity point of view, and it's also pretty bad from a quality point of view, because we don't need diversity just because it's nice. We need it because we actually get better policy making out of it, which will then be democratic. And I think that's the link to democracy for me, and that's why it's such an important thing to have an inclusive policy making in general. That just generally, and I think then young people also bring, I think I wouldn't say that they have necessarily different perspectives, because, for instance, in Germany, there was this huge discussion why young people now vote for the far right. I wasn't, that surprised, because I'm like, you live in a certain society, and when you do have a shift to the far right, then it will affect everyone. It won't affect young people just because they're more idealistic, at least from my perspective. So I think it's also dangerous to kind of put too much hope into the youth and say they are going to solve all the issues. And I think we could hear that in some panels this week, where I didn't really agree with it. So it's also a bit of a simple thing to say the young people are going to solve the issues when they're not necessarily in power. So we need to empower them, make sure that they are sitting at the table, while at the same time making sure that those that already have the power are also responsible and deliver good policies for young people.
Kanishka, do you have advice for our friend, how she can convince Czech politics to follow her lead?
Yeah, well, I think the starting point is one of humility, which is that you should probably advise me on what the British government should be thinking about education reform. Two quick thoughts on this. One, can I just affirm what you're doing, not just in terms of the people's lives that you're touching right now, but its policy implications. One of the things I learned as a policy advisor in government was that evidence is incredibly important. But if you look at the sum total of programs and policies for which there is extremely robust evidence, it's about this big compared to the sum total of possible policies that we could be devising. And for this to expand into a wider set and help way more people in a more effective way, what we need is people who lurch into that white space through a leap of faith, often a sense of agency, and what you're doing is a perfect demonstration of that. And so it's not so much advice, but really an affirmation that what you're doing, and I suspect what so many of you are doing in running programs and initiatives, which might sometimes feel uncertain, but what you're really doing is not just helping those people, but hopefully building the case for policy reform more broadly. The second thing, in terms of specific advice, I wouldn't dare to say anything about the Czech context, but certainly in the British context, is that there is a whole generation of parliamentarians who I think are very open now to ideas, in part because of what happened in politics across many of our countries, which is this age of fragmentation, this age of volatility, which means politics is now much more about persuasion. It's about new ideas rather than resting on the laurels of which tribe or which party you're a part of. And in that context, I think there's a real opportunity to shape ideas by going directly to politicians as well.
Thank you so much for being up on stage with us.
Thank you.
I would be actually curious, because she talked about mentoring, what influence it's played, for example, for you or for maybe the next person who wants to join us then, because I think talking about having young people in power and joining us, often we have this one-way street of like a more experienced person mentoring a younger person, and I'm asking myself like, is this a one-way street? Do we need two? Like, I would be just curious what others think about it.
Brilliant question. Who has an answer? The chair is there for you. Günther, do you qualify as young? Do you feel young at heart? Okay, so please come and join us. And for the next round, we want another young person here.
I'm 56 now, so I'm not totally sure I qualify for young, but I want to contribute.
Please.
No, I think the heroes of this generation of young
You have to use the microphone.
The heroes of this generation of young people are the young Ukrainian soldiers who die at the battlefield of Ukraine today. They are in Kursk. Many of them sacrificed their life or their limbs, and these are the people who deserve all our attention and all our support. And these are the people, I think, applause is good. And I see here a lot of issues in the young generation which are important. The education systems might be, for sure it's important. I was myself also a youth activist and a student leader. Good. The climate is also important. Gender equality and gender rights, it's all important. But we are in this overall war with Russia at the moment. Yeah? And this is the decisive battle of this generation. There is no doubt about that. And this decides the future of Europe. And I have all the appreciation for all the other topics which are important, but this is the overriding, decisive question of our time. And I want to thank the United Kingdom for being fast, decisively, with real weapons. I criticize Austria for doing about nothing under the cover of this vague neutrality, total immoral. Not a single weapon from Austria has reached Ukraine. If it wouldn't have the United Kingdom, Ukraine would have lost. And this is so appalling for me, this moral coolness of Austria, that I'm really shocked. And that's also the reason why I started this NATO campaign, because I'm appalled by the Austrians. They are immoral people. Yeah? Our leadership is disastrous. How can anybody stand idle on the sideline when something happens like that? And so I'm just shocked, and I want to thank the United Kingdom, but also because I have an MP here, I'm also a little bit disappointed by her new Prime Minister, which I in principle
Okay. So we have
Okay.
one big...
Please rejoin the European Union.
Excellent. Thank you. So...
Yes. Marie, over there. There's actually...
yes, please. Come and join us on stage. And please say your name.
This feels like a really weird déjà vu. I was here yesterday, that's right. I'm Esther, lovely to meet you. I wanted to actually answer your question. I was hoping someone else would jump up. But if I think about the mentoring, one thing that I realized, like when I do empowerment work with youth, especially like migrant youth, like I can empower them, but I can't give them the power. And that's what's missing. And that is a one-way street. Like, I don't hold it, so there's other people that need to give it. I think it was a conversation that I had with a lot of people in this forum while being here. Like, I can meet people in power, but it's often behind closed doors. They meet behind closed doors, network behind them, and that doesn't really share the power. So when I think about empowerment, I can do it. I can go both ways. Like, I've experienced it as well. Like, I can empower more senior people, for example, to speak about racism or something, but that's where my power stops. Like, I can't actually achieve the change, because I would need someone else to give me that.
Kanishka, what can you do as a politician to share power?
Yeah, that's a great and tough question. Can I just say two things on that? One of the things I've discovered, having been in policymaking, then in the private sector, and now in politics formally, is that everyone's sort of lurching around trying to figure out where the room is where power sits. And the actual reality of the contemporary context is that in most of those rooms there is very little power. So even a member of parliament or a cabinet minister often lurches around and says, gosh, I'm finding that I'm empowering people, but damn, I don't feel a sense of shared power. And so in some ways, I hope that gives you some starting heart, which is that I think we're all in the same place in this particular context. But let me say something specific about that. That notwithstanding, it is obviously the case that when it comes, for example, to legislation, a member of parliament has an incremental degree of power, and cabinet ministers have more in the British context as well. I think one of the things that I hope I will try and do is open up the conversation, not just behind the doors, but in fact in slightly more open contexts like this, and way more than this. The thing I was talking about of going and knocking doors every single week, trying to set up a local assembly of cross-generational representation from within my constituency on particular topics, child poverty, the future of climate in my constituency. Those are small mechanisms to try and say to people, let's come up with some ideas together, not least because it will involve sharing power and it'll be hopefully empowering for a wider set of people, but for the reason that Stephanie highlighted, which is that I feel very strongly that to bind a sense of change, but also to kind of build your own internal sense of conviction on what you stand for, it is really important to try and do it together with the people that you're a part of in the community. And so I hope that in that small way, I will try and build more and more of that as well.
Sophie, you were disagreeing. Please disagree.
So when you do write a book, you start becoming one of those obnoxious people who says, but I really researched it. When you said that, you don't feel that people in politics are in power, or that it's shared power, and you're not quite sure where the power lies, I think that's part of the problem, because lots of politicians also hide behind that, and they say, oh, but I'm just a parliamentarian. The real power lies, within the Chancellery or within the French President's office, or, in Westminster, I don't know, with the Prime Minister. That's not true. Of course, the power is shared because we live in democracies, and that's a good thing, and that also means that public opinion has a certain power, that journalists have power, that civil society has a share of power, but politicians have a big part of the political power in the end, And then it's also a question of, of course, I would say it depends on the policy fields, but I see that it's also a little bit a way of not owning the power that you have. And I see that a lot because I work at EU level, and very often, it's also this kind of shifting around saying, oh, but that's the parliament who's responsible. Oh, no, that's the council that decides. But in the council, then it's actually in the national ministries that they decide. And I'm like, well, that also makes it very intransparent about who actually takes the decision, and that doesn't really help democracies in the end. So I would be quite careful, because it's true that when you say that you can't empower them, and because you're not in power, political power is in our institutions, and thank God we live in democracies, and that means that there should be a bit more transparency about where it is. One last point about our conception of power. Power can be shared, and I think that's the really horrible thing about us having such a Machiavellian view of power, that you can't, if someone has power, someone else cannot have it. That it's kind of a zero-sum game. Like, I gain power if you lose it, and I can only gain power over you instead of having collective power or power to do things together. So in terms of political power, that's how it is, but I wish that we would kind of shift our perspective a little bit and not have that kind of regressive view of power, which reminds you of House of Cards maybe, or some other things where you have to murder someone, and in German you say go across people's bodies to make sure that you go to the top.
Can I add something to that? I think we need to have a discussion about the perception of what is power. Because if we talk about power, there's so many different angles of it. So I believe that you, working with young people who would maybe not say, oh, I have the power, but I believe, and that's how I felt coming as a 28-year-old, being elected officially into parliament, in every session, in every committee seating, I was the irritation in the room. So you enter, I was young, I was a woman, I had a vision. Like many of the traits, I was born in Australia, so talking about racism, positive racism, the far right decided that I'm okay. So that's the weird part. My friend Alma, she was not okay. So that's also a little cynical. But I think it's a true power if you enter a room, you irritate a room, because then these power structures on a systemic level, they start to move. They need to think about...
But let me challenge you on that a little bit, Stephanie, because that's also a little bit naive, no? I mean, we irritate the system and all of a sudden it will share power with us?
Again?
I said...
Irritate the system? I didn't hear you.
Isn't that a little naive, right? Just by irritating the system starts sharing power.
The thing is, I can remember a lot of seatings we had where there was just the Fridays for Future movement coming up. And they irritated a lot of my fellow MPs, but not only because young people went on the street, because they're the future, they're consumers, they're electing. They're like the future, they're going to elect people into power. So it's really interesting, like looking at from a perspective of, in politics or in general, we, as a consumer, as a citizen, you have the power, and if you stand up, you irritate, and I believe it does something, yes, because they need you.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Who has a view on power here? Thank you. You want to come up? Yes? Yes, I mean you.
I like this. This is so nice.
And please share your name with us.
Hi everyone, I'm Nora. I do have a bit of a perspective on power because I am in a position of power. I'm currently the president of the student union at my university in Vienna. And in Austria, it's kind of a big thing if you are, because you do have a lot of power and you can talk to the ministry, and we have an overall representation of all universities in Austria. And even though I am elected, as the president, and I'm constantly in, conversations with the administration or the rectors or heads of departments, there's just a lack of respect, and there's also no understanding of, what our position is, what our problems are. And even though I have the chance to just talk to them, which is already, a bit of power that most students don't have, I'm not, I mean, I understand I'm not equal to them. In no way I will be equal to them because I am a student and I am, so many years younger than them, and I'm not, administrating a whole university, but I'm trying to represent the voices of students who feel neglected, who feel like they are powerless, and just trying to have a conversation. Often I also feel powerless, even though I should have the chance to, share the grievances and so on.
So what have you learned on how to reverse that? I'm sure you've identified strategies.
Being so nice.
Killing my love. I like it.
Like,
That's the charismatic leader.
Yes.
like I've realized I can be very hard and very determined, but I can also be quite nice, and like, I hope so. But like I have a lot of empathy towards people, and I love to talk with humans and so. And I realize that often in conversation, where for example with the rector, who loves to show the power over me, I'll just listen and maybe just ignore some of the ridiculous comments they're saying, and be constructive and try to be like hear out what they're saying, and being nice and showing solutions without irritating them, and trying to be constructive. But this is because that's my position. At the end of the day, I also don't want to feel alienated by the administration and then constantly be having someone looking over my back, and at some point maybe being kicked out of university because I'm doing something atrocious. I don't know. But yeah, I think working together as a team and just like, of course you can have confrontation, but it should be always in a respectful manner. And I think I've realized that that's always the best way forward.
So you're essentially role modeling for people in power how they should behave towards you.
Yeah, basically.
Now I wonder whether that's a scalable strategy. Kanishka, what's your view here?
She was actually saying she's not irritating, but I believe you are irritating.
I am.
That's like, because you were saying like not but actually that's also a part of irritation, because
Because she's nice.
no, because she is in the room. And I think that's the thing. I think that's so crucial, that you're sitting here, for example, that you are in the room, in the power engine.
This is fascinating. I think you can probably sense that there are differences of style in how we think of power and its pursuit. But let me say something very directly about your contribution, which is that I think one of the things I've learned over the last 15 years of being involved in policymaking is there's a choice in politics, in particular, between the exercise of influence through protest and the exercise of influence through persuasion. And being nice, not just as a tactical thing, but as a substantive thing, of turning up and saying to someone who totally disagrees with you, doesn't think you have standing in the room, whether that's a voter or whoever else, taking that person seriously and finding your way through to a bargain, I think is an underpriced, underestimated thing. I've been a member of the Labour Party my entire adult life, and we have lost again and again and again. And in the last election prior to this one, we were the most loud, dominant voice of protest in public policy in Britain. And it was the greatest defeat we suffered electorally since 1935. And you feel that when you go onto the doorstep. People say you were the right party of protest, but I totally disagreed with you because you weren't taking me seriously and taking my concern seriously and taking my concern seriously in an attitude of niceness, substantively, not just as a tactical game. And so, to me, there are differences of style here, but to me, the fact that the Labour Party has become the party of persuasion, of saying truly the thing I started with, which is that there are people not in these rooms, not in any of these contests of protest, who totally disagree with most people in this room. And you have to take them deeply seriously and think that they have a standing and think that their position ought to shape and change your position, not just out of tactical niceness, but out of genuine niceness and identity with them. That, to me, is kind of my politics.
This kind of speaks to something that I think we talk about quite a bit and think about quite a bit and should be thinking about more, which is, what does true participation actually mean, right? What does participation mean beyond tokenistic ideas of, even honestly just inviting young people on stage and, you know, giving them 2 minutes of airtime, which in a way is also only partially true participation, right? Let's be honest here. So what is required? I'm wondering, Sophie, whether you have insights from your research around, you know, how do we truly include people, especially those, as Kanishka said, that maybe disagree with us? If that's at the root of so much of the populist vote we see today, that people don't actually feel seen, heard, appreciated.
I think we could sit here for another 2 hours for me to expand on that. Can I just come back to the power thing? Because I mean, I had two thoughts. The first one is, when you say, for instance, that you've sometimes felt powerless, I can really understand it in those rooms that they don't take you seriously, they don't respect you, they don't want you to be there, you're irritating. But fundamentally, it's still an interesting thing to think about what level, like how much would you have to expand your power to feel like you have a seat at the table? Like, and then would you want to stop, or would you always want to continue to have more and more and more power? Because one of the big things with power, and that's a big problem at individual level, is that it is a bit of an addiction. And you can see that with people like Putin, of course, but I think it's something you need to be really self-aware of in general. I mean, I'm saying that, but I should probably say that to a lot of leaders that have touched upon it and then became a little bit addicted to it. And if for my book I looked a lot of research, and there was some psychological studies that showed that people in power have less of a sense of empathy. They're less able to listen to others, especially when they're not at the same level as them in the hierarchy. And I think that's something that is really problematic for politics, especially in a democracy. And that's when I'm coming to your question. In a democracy, theoretically, you have every citizen is equal. We all have one vote. We pay our taxes. We have representation. And in the parliament, you do have like different MPs that have all the same standing. But you know, in practice, it's much more difficult, because in the end, the democracy doesn't need to be just about the systems. It also needs to be within the administrations, within, for instance, the governments. And just to give one example, in the German government, I think in the chancellery, you don't have that kind of critical democratic debate that's happening within the chancellery, in my opinion, because of course people that are in the sphere of influence of power already have power, and then they want to keep that power, so they're going to please their bosses, who is above them, rather than please, you know, whoever the citizen is. And that's a fundamental issue that we have in democracies, is that it kind of contradicts a little bit the effects that we see of power that is addictive, that, you know, you have those hierarchies that you will please the person who is above you instead of, you know, the poor citizen who just voted for you. So I think that's something we need to work on.
That's about incentive systems, really.
Yeah.
Right? Like shifting the incentives.
And making sure you have checks and balances. And I mean, it doesn't go into participation. I think it's not done with participation, because in the end it's about sharing power. And sharing power is extremely difficult. And I think that's why, for instance, I always am for deliberative democracy, and I think it's super important to have citizens' assemblies. But you know, it might also mean that the parliament might have a little bit less power, because citizens' assemblies will decide something, and they won't say it openly, but you know, it hurts a little bit to kind of share that power. So that's what we need to learn, sharing power to make participation work in democracy, and also maybe rethinking how, or have those checks and balances within the spheres of influence of very powerful people.
Kanishka, you were saying that you're putting together such a citizen assembly, if I understood it correctly. Are you also planning to share power with them, or is it more of a listening sounding board conversation?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is it's primarily a listening and advisory sounding board. And notwithstanding Sophie's point, the reality is an individual MP has almost no marginal power over a piece of legislation in the British government. And so even if I stood up and said to the Citizens' Assembly, hey, I'd love for you to decide, and whatever you decide on a particular area of regulation, I will do, that would be a false promise. And it's interesting because this applies in many different levels. It applies at the level of decision-making ability. It also applies in the mismatch between what most members of the public think is the most salient issue they want to talk about, and what a particular level of government is focused on. So most of my inbox, I get 150 emails or so a day from constituents. Most of them are focused on potholes, bins, the quality of the road. None of those are the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. They are all municipal city government or regional government issues. But there is a total dissipation of where power resides. And I think to take seriously the question of how you actually honestly share power, I think you have to be honest in your assessment of the fact that actually power is indeed extremely diffuse in the modern context. And so the Citizens Assembly idea, which is focused currently on two main issues that I'm really passionate about, tackling child poverty and tackling green energy locally, is partly about being a listening and sounding board, but honestly, it's actually largely also about generating collective community energy for specific ideas. And so on the climate front, for example, I really want to build up some sense of consensus that we are going to do this practical thing locally, which may not move the needle from a kind of international regulatory point of view, but can maybe then be a demonstration for how someone else might do something, to use soft power of what we can do locally and show that example nationally, but it's primarily a listening and demonstration exercise.
Nora, what would you like to see? How would you like, powerful people to be sharing power? Do you have ideas of how to shift that?
What a question. I mean, just so it's clear, like even though I am elected as the president, we work very much as a team. So it's not me who's like making all the decisions, because you need a third of a vote for something to pass within our student union. But I am often, the representative if we go to the rector and then there's someone else. But as you said, people are power hungry, and I mean, I'm not power hungry myself. I'm happy that I'm not going to be in power anymore. I'm resigning this year because I'm going on my exchange year. So thank God, because honestly, I've had it, But I don't know how you share power, and there are I don't know. I can't think of any case in my mind of a good example where power has been shared, and it's difficult because some people who are in power are doing really good things with their power, and I don't know why. I can think about, for example, the Austrian president, right? He doesn't really have such a powerful role in the actual decision making, but just his voice and the things he's saying are extremely powerful, and I think a lot of people are listening to him, and I think that's a great way of using your power. And then, of course, there are people like Putin or Orban who are just focused on their individual power, and also just parties as well, who are doing everything they can to just stay in power and be in control of the government. I don't think I have an answer to you. Maybe in 20 years,
maybe someone else. Yeah.
Thank you.
Come up on stage, please. Thank you, Nora. Ideas and good examples for sharing power. Yes, please. And please say your name.
Hello, I'm Csenge. I'm from Hungary. And I was part of the Palumba team. And we did a voting advice application for the European parliamentary elections to promote young people to vote. And my question would be that, yes, we can put people in power by voting, but also we have a restricted kind of amount where we can choose. If I see the Hungarian MPs, most of them are older people and not young people. And then it's a question for you. Do you think that we should regulate how old MPs can be, or just lower how young people can vote? Because for the European Parliament elections in Austria it was 16, in Hungary it was still 18. And do you think it could work?
So sharing power through lowering the voting age, right? That's a very concrete way of approaching this. I mean, there's been very controversial, suggestions to actually not allow older people to vote, right? Personally, I would never agree with that, but that's also a way of sharing power. Yes,
Can
Sophie?
I just go, because having followed a little bit the kind of electoral reform initiatives in the EP, because right now the European electoral law is extremely fragmented. So you do have countries like Germany and Austria where you have a voting age of 16, others where it's 18. I think in Greece it's even 17. That's not really democratic if you have like a European election, of course. I'm not talking about all the other things, such as like there's different voting methods in Europe, there's different voting days. It's basically 27 different elections. And especially in countries like, I'm French and German, so I can only speak about those two with a little bit more knowledge. In Germany, where you have a demographic that is extremely old, you really do have a generational gap. And I think it does showcase also in the political preferences of people, especially when it comes to, for instance, investments or the pension system. And in those cases, I think it is fair enough to say, the youth is a minority in that case. You should lower the voting age to make sure that they're a little bit more represented, simply for future-proofing legislation and for making sure it's generationally just. And in that cases, I think it definitely is a fair point to say you should lower the voting age.
But is that, I actually have problems when we think of democratic participation only as voting, right? That is a very, very important thing that we do as citizens. But to me, that, is only one part of our power as citizens, our role as citizens, our obligation as citizens. So I'm wondering that maybe by, thinking of voting, we're not broadening our view enough around that question of, participation, of the role of young leaders, of, hearing those voices and having those voices not only be heard, but actually have them act.
You talked about actually one of the questions you asked was, what is true participation? And what I see is there are actually a lot of opportunities to participate, but then there is this kind of power play where you have, for example, public initiatives, you have all kinds of things you can vote, you can get engaged, but then often MPs or people in power listen, but then it's just a thank you and okay, next. So the question is then the integration part. I think that's the really tricky part where our system is not really welcoming and has not really a system in place to say, okay, how can we really be radical inclusive or really inclusive in a way to take ideas which really come from assemblies and integrate them. Because right now, the parliament listens to them, nods and says, actually you're right, next. And that happens a lot. And I've seen a lot of people who have been spending years on these campaigns and being
So what do we do about it?
I believe, because that was her question as well, not only lowering the age, it's like, who do we have us representing in parliament? So I believe, yes, we need more young people and newcomers, like people who have been really working in the fields, working in different, and have always been in politics. I think we also need them. I think we need a mix. The same with age. We need young people, we need all kinds of ages, but we need people who've been in politics and people who are kind of newcomers and can bring that expertise on the one hand, and the other hand is, I think people who have been in politics too long, they should do internships and stuff like that. They should go out and really, if they're I think they should get a reality check. When things like that come in, you have to go out.
Sorry. Maybe we can ask everyone in the room here to think whether you could offer an internship to a politician. That might be the next step of our scholarship, is that we award scholarships to politicians to do internships.
Can I
yes,
clarify a bit?
Please.
So I meant to be a president, you need to be 35 years old in some of the countries, but you can be a president when you are 78, 80, anything, for example, in America, like the US. And that's why can't I be a president at 24, but people who might not be at their top level of thing, can still be presidents just because they served as like part of Congress or something for years. They had the background, they had the power, they had support, and like.
I mean, diversity studies tell us that it's good to have a mix, right? To have a mix of ages, of perspectives. Kanishka, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I won't comment on the age question, given the age distribution of my colleagues in Parliament. But I will just say one thing which I think is really important for us to take seriously when we're thinking about participation, which is Stephanie's totally right. Our current mechanisms for public consultation on policy questions is extremely ineffective. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that politicians who don't listen to them keep getting re-elected? What is the incentive structure, or what is wrong with the incentive structure, which means that even when people don't feel they're heard, they vote for particular politicians? And maybe part of it is because sort of choosing the worst of a pretty bad lot. But I think part of it is also taking seriously the sense that currently people who might be very actively engaged in consultation are a relatively small and particular proportion. That's been my experience of British politics, which is that we are not taking seriously enough the constraints most people experience in their day-to-day life of participating, even in our very ineffective public consultations at the moment. So they don't see an obvious link between the fact that the politician hasn't listened to your citizens' assembly or input into the public consultation and who is standing in the election. And so if we're talking about participation seriously, we have to take seriously the constraint that most people feel, which is that for most people that I have spoken to on the doorstep in the Vale, and I think it's true of all my colleagues who've spoken to their constituents, the share of time, mind space, and family dinner time that they spend on politics explicitly is very, very small.
So this brings us to our last round, which is a question for all four of you here now. You are now included. Is there anything you're taking from this conversation that makes you do something differently tomorrow? Sophie?
I need more time to think.
Okay, then Kanishka, you already have an idea.
Yeah, look, I think this has been a really interesting insight into how each of us thinks about power. The one thing I feel is that whilst formal power is extremely diffuse, and I think is, in the British context at least, concentrated in a very small set of sites, I will take seriously Sophie's criticism, which is that I think whenever each of us is in a room, we have that little iota of power in shaping the conversation, in pushing it, if not in the full direction of protest and irritation, then at least slightly nudging the envelope in the direction that can make a difference. And so I will be carrying that spirit with me from tomorrow.
Thank you.
I really like the internship idea. I was just thinking about, I see people from context. I was like, imagine having politicians, for example, if there are referendums in the process, to send them out for like a certain amount of time, because that's what I realized also, and what I actually wished I would have time, because I had so many topics on my table, and sometimes I wished I could really spend more time in the field and understanding what it was really about.
So what will you do differently?
I'm actually going to follow up on it. I'm going to think about it. So if anyone has ideas, maybe we should do something about that.
How about you?
I don't know yet. Can we go with?
Sure. I mean, I think it's actually a good sign that people think about their answer. So thank you.
And it also showcases how difficult it is to actually say what you're going to change about it, because it's nice to have discussions at a meta level, but then actually, how is it going to affect your actions is another thing. And maybe that's what I'm taking with, is that maybe I should, because I don't feel like particularly young because I've been doing that for a while now, and sometimes you just kind of get used to doing something. You're getting good at, speaking, but then you're not necessarily good at kind of taking your own advice and embracing it. So I will take my own advice and I will think about what I'm going to change more.
Thank you.
Okay, for me it will be like to approach people in power with kindness. I really like that idea. And I was vice president of my student organization previously, but it not really worked out for us because our president was not always approaching people with kindness. And I think this is a really good idea to try it out.
Excellent. So we'll all be kinder. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for being here.